Guys, here we go. Kinesiology 223, Chapter 8, book presentation number 3. Specifically, we're talking about gender and sexuality, gender and sport and physical activity, and Title IX. This is some pretty interesting stuff with things that are going on in our world right now. Let me get myself out of the way. So, in some regard, I think the book kind of misused the word sexuality as opposed to using sex. You really won't see sexuality per se written in the context of Title IX or DEI, etc. You know, sexuality has a completely different connotation than sex or gender. Anyways, so the review of most cases pertaining to Title IX, you know, it refers to the equality in sports, but you have to understand that you know, Title IX didn't actually start off being specific to sports, and I'll get to that in a second. But most of the time when you see literature or you see case review or results of cases, you won't see anything pertaining to sexuality. You'll see sex and gender. And, you know, they do clarify or further clarify later on, and they put in the terminology text in the text. They put in sex as opposed to sexuality. Anyways, moving on. If we look at this, we can look at gender versus sex, and this is kind of at the foundation for most of the lawsuits that you see and most of the decisions that you'll see pertaining to Title IX and equality in sports. So with gender, that's based off the social, cultural, and psychological roles, you know, behaviors and identities associated with being male or female or non-binary, and it's how a person perceives themselves. And you'll hear like the terminology, I was born misgendered, etc. And you know, it can be from a social construct, and you know, it can be influenced by cultural norms and expectations. So it's a little bit of a complexity there in terms of in terms of like your own social structure, and also perhaps as an individual, how they perceive themselves relative to cultural norms. When you look at sex, it's pretty straightforward. You know, it's biological and physiological characteristics of the person. It focuses on biological and physical traits. You know, it's determined by biological factors like chromosomes, an XX or an XY, right? Hormone levels and reproductive organs. So when you look at most of the case law pertaining to this, that's what you'll see, this kind of definition that goes on back and forth between gender and sex. And that's really at kind of the foundation for most of where these cases are heading. Excuse me. You know, the book makes the argument that the primary differences experienced between biological male and female athletes are attributed to psychosocial determinants such as gender role stereotypes and gender role expectations. And I have some issues with that. You know, as somebody who has coached athletes and worked with people for the majority of my work, not majority, I mean, all of my working career, the book doesn't take the time to speak to the differences in the amount of lean muscle mass between males and females, body composition between males and females, biological males and females, and we're talking sex, not gender, somatotypes per se, limb length differences in terms of height, and then just other physiological differences. So I think the book spent time focusing on one particular area regarding the psychosocial domain, as opposed to really focusing on the physiological side of it. Now, in terms of, you know, any sport, think of what softball players look like compared to baseball players, what, you know, women's basketball players look like compared to male basketball players. One of the main areas, or one of the main sports where you have this kind of equality that's built in, is wrestling because of the weight classes. But other than that, you can really pick the differences between your male participant and your female participant. So we jump into microaggressions at this point. And I agree with the book regarding what microaggressions are, but I don't really agree with how they presented it, you know, in a one-way street. And yeah, I'm not saying it's just because I'm a male, right? And we're talking microaggressions, but you know, it could be something that happens to a male. It depends upon the environment. A microaggression can happen to somebody who is Caucasian if they walk into an all-black fraternity, if they walk into like the Kappa house, you could have microaggressions happen. And again, I say it all the time, it's determinant upon the situation, time, and place, and the participants involved. And also, I think where the book missed here too is they missed on comments regarding microaggressions against, the lesbian, gay, bi, trans, queer populations as well. And I thought they could have spent some time really digging into that area, just because it's become such a hot button area, and you could spend a little time there because that's a population that really, I mean, they get not just microaggressions, but they get macroaggressions. And it's unfortunate to that population. So let's talk Title IX. The original Title IX statute made no specific mention, regarding sports. It's an extension of the Civil Rights Law of the 1960s, and it was amended in 1988 to include Title IX. The civil rights laws were amended in 1988 to include Title IX, and that coverage it covers all persons at any educational institution that receives federal funding. This is where it ties back into the Department of Education. And you can Google Civil Rights Restoration Act, and that'll lead you to this. But the verbiage is pretty precise, and it reads as follows. No person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So notice in the verbiage, they don't talk gender, they talk sex. They talk the biological sex of the person. That's where most of the arguments have really been pushed in this area at this point. And it ties back into, if there is discrimination, the Department of Education, through this act, can actually pull funding for a college or a school, a program, an athletic program, if they so choose, because of Title IX being tied to the funding through the Department of Education. Now, athletics became progressively involved in the conversation through the Equity in Athletics Disclosure Act of 1994. And this required institutions to disclose things like how many people are on rosters, the scholarships, coaches, budgets, salaries, and expenses. And that's when you started to see programs, colleges cut programs, because what you had to have was your athletic population had to be a representation of your college population. If you were 50-50 male, female, then your athletic population had to be 50-50 in terms of participation. So you saw schools cut the wrestling program and add a women's cross country to drop the men's side, raise the women's side to have greater equilibrium. And you saw that you had this kind of challenging environment for schools that had 100 football players, because all the football players are male, and they had to come up with the ability to have an equal number ratio-wise to that on the female side. And so you had to, these colleges had to disclose not only the numbers of people on the rosters and how many were male and how many were female, the scholarships awarded for each, the budgets, as well as the salaries for the coaches. And also you had a scrutinizing of the race of the people who were on each team, or the athletes on each team, and the coaches as well. So it's been a highly evolving space when you start talking about Title IX over the last, maybe 5 to 10 years. And you're really seeing this kind of whipsawing back and forth as we march through one administration going into another administration, especially one that's threatening to defund and take away half of the government, and that'd be including Department of Education. But it's been kind of fast moving in terms of litigation. So, the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights issued a notice that the office will enforce Title IX on discrimination, including discrimination against sexual orientation and gender identity. Okay, so then you have this conversation of a transgender female playing volleyball at San Jose State, and I'm sure you saw that in the news this past year, and that created a whole series of events. Meanwhile, marching behind the scenes, in May of 2020, the Department of Education issued a counter letter stating that the policy of Connecticut to allow transgender girls to compete in sports, there was a lawsuit that was making its way through the courts that was Connecticut Department of Education, I think it was, or some school district in Connecticut. I'm trying to remember the verbiage on that. That was being challenged in terms of allowing transgender females to participate in sport, and so in girls' sports, excuse me. And so you had this this statement that came from the Department of Education that the policy of Connecticut to allow transgender girls to compete in girls' sports was a violation of civil rights of the female athletes, and stating that doing so limits opportunities for the female athletes, which is exactly what Title IX, well, it wasn't exactly, Title IX was actually originated for a graduate student, a female graduate student who wanted to go to school for her doctorate, and she was discriminated against because she was female, and they didn't want to have a female in the program. That's where it really started off. But it's interesting that now the Department of Education, or at that time, the Department of Education in 2020 is stating that this limits the opportunity of female athletes, which runs counter to a previous statement that discrimination would be defined as discriminating against sexual orientation or gender identity. Okay, so we're looking at the verbiage changing from gender to sex. Then became Protect Women in Sports Act, which has kind of been re-upped, I believe, over the last 4 years. I think there was a case actually more recently that was more specific to this, but this would block funding if transgendered girls and non-binary people were allowed to compete on girls' sports teams. So you can just see how much it's evolved, And if we take this a little bit further and we look at like the Protect Women in Sports Act, by definition, this would be discriminatory and very specific to a population, which would go against Title IX, except for the fact that the arguments that are being made within the court system are specific to gender versus sex. And as we've seen different cases progress through the courts, these cases will end up being the guidepost for athletic directors to help manage their athletic departments going forward. One can just imagine as we march through in 2024 and we go into 2025, what some of these cases will look like. The Supreme Court declined to reinstate the Biden administration's revised Title IX, which aimed to protect transgender. Then you go into lower court rulings, like January, this is very recent, of 25, struck down the Biden administration expanded Title IX protections. And, this was in response to lawsuits filed by Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, Ohio, Virginia, and West Virginia. And now you get into another one in January in 2025, where the House of Representatives have approved a bill to ban transgender girls and women from participating in girls' sports in federally funded schools by amending Title IX. And you can see the vote. And so you can just look at this and look at these last two slides and really understand how this is an ongoing legal battle. And the debates that are going on back and forth specific to transgender athletes have been, to me, quite interesting, because I think it's really wildly interesting to see this kind of go on. And, you don't have a final ruling as of yet, but it's very dynamic and, potential decisions that can significantly affect the interpretation of Title IX. But not only that, but the protection for transgendered individuals. And also, with some of these results, you'll have entire athletic departments who have to figure out just what the heck they're going to do based off of a decision by the Supreme Court. So I would pay attention to this space because I think it's wildly interesting, and you're really seeing this kind of fluidity as the court cases are being solved or resolved over and over. So with that, I'm moving on to the next presentation.